Hello, and welcome to our second session on family engagement using relationship-based strategies. And so this time we are going to explore this idea of really thinking about perspectives and influences and looking at family engagement, partnering with families through a cultural lens. So I want to start with just having you think about your own experiences and your own family, right? So reflect back on your childhood, your upbringing. What were the attitudes, beliefs, and values around caregiving and relationships for young children? How have these beliefs and values changed over time? What perhaps have you done differently with your own children? Um, if you're raising a family of your own, what are some things that have changed? And what caused those changes, right? So we have our 3 questions posted here on the slide. And I am going to pause for a moment and give you a chance to reflect and to write down your thoughts. Okay. So now that you've had a minute to reflect and to write down some thoughts, we are going to move into thinking about and exploring perspective taking, right? And really thinking about what does it mean to take the perspective of another? How can we build our own skills and competencies on reflecting on our own perspectives, our own beliefs and values, and then acknowledging and recognizing those of others, right? I really enjoy the framework of ask, acknowledge, and adapt from the program for infant and toddler care. And so it's asking you to really be aware of when there is a difference and to ask. So to make a point to regularly talk to families, engage with families, and ask them about what are their beliefs and values, what are their hopes and dreams for their child, and to acknowledge when there's a difference, right? Or when maybe perhaps you're feeling a little bit of conflict because of the difference in perspectives or in values or in priorities or the perspectives that you have based upon your own upbringing, your own values, your own culture, and that of a family, right? And then you want to adapt as much as possible, right? Because really what we want is to provide caregiving and educational experiences for young children that match the culture of the family, that match the priorities, the beliefs, the values of the family, that we are focusing on goals that families have for their children. Now, this doesn't always work. Sometimes there may be requirements put on you by your funders, by licensing, by regulations, or the goal that a family may have may not be developmentally appropriate, but you can start with that goal and then using your early learning and development standards, using what you know about child development, using your curriculum, talk about, well, these are the building blocks that will get to that goal eventually. And so let's talk about how we can support that skill right now and what makes sense for the age of this child. So we are going to watch a video and really thinking about the role of culture and language in programs. How is culture and language represented in your program? How might knowledge of cultural influences on emotions affect your work with families? And what other aspects of interaction may be influenced by culture? So I encourage you to note down these 3 questions or hold them in your mind as we watch this video.
In Palo Alto, California, on Stanford University's campus, children come to Bing Nursery School to explore,
Should we go check on the bunny?
to engage,
She does a little bit of everything. She likes the art, she likes the self-help, she likes playing on the street. She does a little bit of everything.
and to express themselves in the different activities they choose to participate in.
Today, I just saw her play in the blocks area, and they made like an airplane out of the blocks. And they were going to all these different places.
It looks like it looks like a bone of a dinosaur.
A bone of a dinosaur?
Like a claw.
Oh, maybe a claw. Is that how they used to dig?
While the materials or toys might vary, Bing looks like so many pre-K environments across the country.
It is a place where it's just this melting pot of just people from everywhere. And it doesn't have to be outside America, but even within America, there's just so much diversity from different states, the language, the traditions. And it's just a wonderful place where everybody can come and just be and be honored, be received just where they are.
This one is called 四个眼睛蝴蝶鱼.
Bing parents know that their children's heritage is cherished, even celebrated.
We speak a lot of Mandarin at home. When we read books, I try to translate it into Chinese, and she speaks Mandarin with my nanny every day. And then with me, about half the time. I'm Chinese by heritage, and my husband is Korean, so we have a little bit of a mix in our household.
I'm Canadian, and I grew up speaking French, and so language as a whole is really important to us.
In a classroom 2 years ago, we counted the number of countries represented. We had 22 different countries in one classroom, that many different countries. And it was probably the most amazing experience. The teachers embraced it.
The little girl is far from home.
As schools across America become more diverse, what are the implications of culture in the classroom? Dr. Jeannie Tsai, who directs the Culture and Emotions Lab in the Psychology Department at Stanford, says for starters, culture greatly influences what's known as our ideal affect.
Ideal affect refers to the affective states or the feelings that people value, desire, ideally want to feel. And this is really as opposed to the feelings that people actually have, or what we call their actual affect.
Dr. Tsai initially conducted a series of studies with adults, some European American, some East Asian, to measure the specific feelings they ideally wanted to feel or their ideal affect.
What we found was that North American contexts, European American contexts, really value these excitement states, or what we call high arousal positive states, like excitement, enthusiasm, elation, more than many East Asian contexts, which really value the more calm states, calm, peacefulness, serenity, what we call these low arousal positive states. And what's interesting is that across a variety of different studies and samples, we always find these cultural differences in how people want to feel or their ideal affect. And we often don't find any differences in how people actually feel. And we think that this is because culture teaches us what's desirable, what's moral, what's virtuous. A lot of cultural psychologists have talked about that as being one of the primary roles of culture. And we've just applied this to the idea of emotions, that culture also teaches us what emotions are moral, right, and virtuous.
At what age do culture and cultural differences affect ideal affect?
Kids begin to develop an understanding of the emotions that they should feel or that they should display on their faces right around preschool age, between the ages of 3 and 5. So we reason that once they developed this kind of understanding, that's when we should see cultural differences in ideal affect.
Dr. Tsai and her colleagues tested their theory.
Which one do you think is more happy?
They did a series of studies at Bing
That one?
and a comparable nursery school in Taiwan, showing 3 groups of children, European American, Asian American, and Taiwanese Chinese, pictures of smiley faces.
Thank you.
We found that the European American kids were more likely to say that the excited smile was a smile that they wanted to be, and that it was the smile that they thought was more happy, compared to the Taiwanese Chinese kids. And the Asian American kids, who are bicultural, were right in the middle.
An acrobat, a bear, a cloud, and a dinosaur.
After establishing that there were cultural differences in ideal affect among young children, Dr. Tsai set out to identify how children learn to value certain affective states. She and her team decided to look at the content of popular children's storybooks. They predicted that the content of these storybooks should reflect the cultural differences in ideal affect that they observed in kids and adults.
The turtle, the umbrella, the thick book of stories.
Her students used a well-established coding system for studying emotional expressions to identify the types of emotions expressed by the characters in the best-selling storybooks in the U.S. and Taiwan. While the characters in the American and Taiwanese storybooks expressed the same number of smiles, they differed in the specific kind of smile they expressed.
You can read American storybooks and see that a lot of the characters have more of these excited smiles than compared to the Chinese storybooks.
Ashley likes to jump.
Then, in a final study, Dr. Tsai and her colleagues read European American, Asian American, and Taiwanese Chinese children storybooks that differed in how much excitement and how much calm the characters expressed. They found that across cultures, the kids who read the storybook with the excited expressions, when then presented with those excited and calm smiles, were more likely to say that the excited smile was a happier smile.
These findings suggest that at least in the short term, when kids are exposed to these kinds of storybooks with a certain kind of content, it does switch their ideal affect or their affective preferences. And we think that this is a proxy for what happens more chronically when kids are being exposed to all these things in their environments that are teaching them to want to feel a certain way.
Dr. Tsai's findings help Bing staff help children regulate their emotions with careful consideration to how one's culture might value a certain emotional state.
It certainly informs us and makes us more aware, and that awareness really helps because you're not quick to judge. And you can actually really talk as a team and really talk about that child's culture. Just because someone doesn't necessarily speak the language, because a child is more reflective, more of an observer, then you really understand that perhaps it's not just that the child's shy, but the child might just be, that might be a cultural piece to that child, and we really do value that.
For Bing parents, it's not only their own culture, but the school's culture that has helped shape their perspective.
I often look at outside of the lens that I was raised, and I really do appreciate that about this community, is you get to see different styles, different traditions, and incorporate.
It was a very strict upbringing, and I agree with part of it and I disagree with part of it. And so now as a parent, I struggle with what my upbringing was like versus how I want to change it. And so I'm trying to find the middle road.
Let's make a doctor plane, Audrey. Yeah, doctor plane.
While children's emotions may be due in part to their temperaments, which they're born with, Dr. Tsai and the staff at Bing believe that children's emotions, especially the ones that they value, are also heavily shaped by their cultures.
You're not a teacher just to the child. You are there for the family. So taking the time to build that rapport and relationship with the family is key, because who the child is where they're coming from, the parents.
I think it's really important to consider not only how culture shapes the languages that people are speaking or the kinds of foods they're eating, but also how culture shapes the students' psyches and how they're thinking and feeling and relating to others. And I think if educators can be sensitive to those cultural differences, then we can reduce the likelihood of misunderstandings, mischaracterizing a child as disengaged or as not being creative or not having the potential to be a leader when they might have all of those things. They're just coming from a culture that manifests those qualities in a different way.
Still exploring all the colors.
If we could have classrooms that could accommodate that and really benefit and capitalize on the cultural differences, I think we would all learn much more rather than being restricted to just one way of being.
Are you ready?
Capitalizing on cultural differences to create a rich learning environment where children can thrive.
Okay. So let's move back into our PowerPoint. And again, to really think about these questions and what you learned in the video, and really thinking about how we express emotions, how we communicate based upon our culture. And so as we think about the video and think about these questions, again, to really reflect on how our culture and language represented in your program. How might knowledge of cultural influences on emotions affect your work with families? And what other aspects of interaction may be influenced by culture? We also want to think about our developmental expectations, right? And recognizing that research and theory on how children grow and develop and our widely held expectations of when children should know and be able to do certain things is based predominantly on white European culture, right? So if we look at the revised statement on developmentally appropriate practice from the National Association for the Education of Young Children, and we look at particular in their document on the core considerations, right? Part of what it talks about is the importance of context and the importance of recognizing the role of culture, the role of family, the role of community in the experiences that children have, but also in those developmental expectations, and to recognize that the research that our field is based upon is not inclusive and may not represent development for all children in all cultures, right? And so we know, particularly looking at neuroscience and looking at what we know about development as human beings, right? That there are a lot of things that are similar. There are things that we have in common, right? But also a lot of our development is influenced by our experiences and by the expectations of the adults that are caring for and teaching young children. And you can particularly see this in terms of self-help skills and development of infants and toddlers. And, you know, we think about the dominant American culture and a real belief in independence and self-help skills, and there's a real push to support children in moving from a bottle to a sippy cup to a cup, right? Having young children, infants learn to be mobile, learn to walk as often as possible. I remember lots of conflict when I was a child care director, around young children who were able to walk being carried into the program by their parents, right? For other families, for other cultures, that relationship, that caregiving, that interdependence is more important than independence, right? And so we really want to think about, what is the role of culture? What is the role of individual families' beliefs and values in terms of how we think about what a child should know and be able to do at different ages and stages? So again, another piece for you to reflect upon and maybe write down some notes, perhaps connect with a colleague around, is to think about your own upbringing, children you know, or experiences you've had, and to talk about the prompts here. And so I'm going to take you to this handout. In thinking about child and culture. And so this gets at some of those pieces that I've raised, right? At what age do we expect children to be able to feed themselves, take their first steps, calm themselves when angry, right? What are our expectations around these skills? And how does that differ between your experiences in your own upbringing, perhaps your experiences in parenting and raising children, and your experiences in caring for children, and teaching children in your program, and connecting with families, the experiences of a colleague or someone else that you work with. And so I encourage you to think through these prompts and respond to these questions. So to recognize that there are guideposts for growth and development, right? The milestone moments from the CDC is a great resource around what children should know and be able to do, and gives us some guidelines, particularly when we have concerns. Your early learning and development standards also give you that guideline. Your curriculum and informal assessment may give you some of that guidance, right? But we also have to have flexibility and really recognizing that our expectations for specific behaviors and interaction patterns are influenced by culture. And so to really take time to think about, is there conflict between the expectations that you have for a child that is in your classroom, that is in your program, and the expectations that that family has? And is there a cultural component behind that conflict? And so again, there are some questions here for you to think about, for you to reflect on, right? And considering these expectations, considering your experiences, and to think about when there has been conflict, when there has been a difference in your expectation and the expectation of an individual family. And how as a program have you managed that? Another really great resource is these multicultural principles. And so if we move back into our documents and resources here, we can go to that. And so This document has lots of really great information that gives us information on these principles, right? That every individual is rooted in culture, that cultural groups represented in the communities and families of each program are primary sources. So we really want to be connecting with our families and our communities that we're working in. And I do encourage you to recognize that a lot of these resources are developed by the Office of Head Start, but are relevant for all programs. And so when you see the word Head Start, just think early childhood program. And so these principles really help us to dive deeper and think about how to interact with families, how to provide care and education that is culturally and linguistically responsive. Okay, so thank you very much. And next time we will dive into our next section on wondering about families.